Hey everyone, I am Nitij, and in this video I will show you how the JWTs are structured by creating them from scratch in the C# code using a .NET Core web application. JSON Web Tokens, or in short JWTs, are very commonly used to securely transmit information between two parties. It is an open standard and it represents a compact URL safe way of representing claims to authenticate as well as authorize already authenticated persons or users. The information which is contained inside the JWT is digitally signed with a secret key using the HMAC algorithm. They can also be encrypted using the RSA algorithm, which involves using public and private key pairs. Some of the benefits of JWTs are that they are compact and self-contained. Self-contained simply means that JWTs can contain all the information which is required for authorization without querying any kind of data source. In this video, I will show you how the JWTs are structured. We will authenticate a user's credentials and will then construct a JSON Web Token. It will be then sent to the application which is running in the browser. The application will save the JWT in the browser and then will send it in the authorization header with each resource request made to the application server. Also treat this video just for learning how the JWTs work. I would not advise you to write your own code for sending and receiving JWTs between parties. Use an already existing library or framework to authenticate requests which are using JSON Web Tokens. So before starting to create the code example, I would like to thank you all for watching this video. If you think that you like this video while watching it, feel free to place a like on it, and also please hit the subscribe button. Doing that will make sure that you will always be the first to know about the latest video updates. This is a basic MVC application created using ASP.NET Core, and there are two API controllers. The first one is the login controller, which will be used by the user to log in into the application, and the second one is the employee controller, which will be used by the user to get the list of employees. Now there are some other model classes as well, like for the login there is a class which has the properties for username and password, and the user or the browser will have to send the username and password to be able to authenticate with the application. And then there is the view model for the user, which has the properties for the name of the user and the privilege. The name will be used to identify the user and the privilege will be used to identify the authorization level. And the third one is the employee, and the employee class has the property name, age and salary. This class is just there to test the authorization of JSON Web Tokens. So if the user has the authorization level of an admin, then he or she will be able to access the list of employees. Otherwise, the code should not return the list of employees. Alright, so before we proceed any further, I would like to explain to you the basic structure of a JSON Web Tokens. So a JSON Web Token consists of three parts. The first one is a header, the second one is a payload, and the third one is the signature. The header is in the JSON format and it contains two properties. The first one is the algorithm, which will be used to compute the hash of the JSON Web Tokens, and the second one is the type, and the type is JWT. The second one is the payload. So payload is the part which contains the claims. Claims are basically statements about an entity, like for any user, and claims also contain additional metadata. Claims are generally of three types when it comes to JSON Web Tokens. They are of the type either reserved or public or private. So reserved claims are predefined claims. We may or may not use them. When we expose our application's authentication system to be used globally by any user out there, then it is recommended to use the reserved claims because they are common everywhere, like for example the expiration time, the subject, the issuer, etc. Then there are public claims. The public claims are not like reserved claims, but still we should try to use a public claim name which should not conflict with other public claims. The third ones are the private claims, and the private claims are created to share information between two consenting parties so that they can decide on the name of the private claims. An example of a payload can be this one. They can be the name of the user, they can be the privilege status, or there can be some additional metadata information. The final part is the signature part, and to create the signature we have to take the base 64 URL encoded header, the base 64 URL encoded payload, and then we will use the algorithm which is specified in the header to compute the hash to sign the header and the payload. And we will also use a secret so that anyone who is listening or watching the JSON Web Token will not be able to tamper with the JSON Web Tokens. So a signature typically looks something like this. We encode the header and payload concatenated using a dot, and we will also use a secret, and this entire thing will be the signature. Now when we will have to transmit the entire JSON Web Token, then what we will do is we will simply first use the base 64 URL encoded header and then a dot and then base 64 URL encoded payload. Let me just bring it up so that you guys can see it, and then finally a dot and then the base 64 URL encoded signature, and that is the entirety of the JSON Web Token which we will send to the browser. The browser will save this JWT and then it will send this JWT to the server with every request within an authorization header. Alright then, so it's time to start the code example. First we will code the login controller, and we are doing this to just create a basic setup to support the transmission of JWTs between the server and the client browser. So the login controller's post method is accepting the login object as an argument. So we will check if the credentials are correct or not, and we can simply check the hard-coded credentials, like for example if login obj dot username is let's say John, and if login obj dot password is password, then we will authenticate this user and we will return a new object with the message that authentication is successful along with the token. So let's just use the name JWT token for the token's property name, and right now I'm just going to set it with an empty string because we will compute the token in a moment. And if the login is not successful, if the credentials are not correct, then we can simply return another message that the authentication failed. We can call this login controller from the index view, and for that we have to open up the index.cs HTML, and I'm just going to remove this entire thing, the existing HTML markup. The first thing that we will do is to create a div, and inside this div we need to have a button which when clicked will login us into this application. Let's also have a span so that we can print out the message which will be returned from the server. Next we will need the JavaScript code to bind the click event with this btn login button. First let's just fetch the references of the btn login button and this span message, and now we can bind a click event to this btn login button by simply calling the add event listener function and then writing the name of the event which is click, and we can use an arrow function. Now inside this arrow function we will call another function which will be called as login, which will log us into the application. Now let's take another look at the login controller's post. So this controller function is accepting the argument login object which is of this type login obj. So because login obj has two properties, username and password, so we have to send this object from this index.cs HTML's JavaScript code. So let's just create the function login, so async function login, and the first thing that we will do is to create a new login obj object, and there it is. Now let's have the properties. The first one is the username, and let's set the username as John because we will be using these hard-coded values to authenticate the credentials. And let's also use the password as password. The second thing that we need to do is to create the options object that we will use to provide the body into which we have to write the stringified version of this login object, and we will also need to provide the value of the method and the content type. So options object is this one. Now the first thing that we will provide over here is the method, which is post, and second we have to provide the headers, and inside the headers we need to provide the property content type. This is going to have the value of application JSON, and finally we have to provide the value for the body, which is going to contain the stringified version of the login obj. So login obj. Now it's time to use the fetch API to call the post method of login controller. So let response equals to await fetch, and we need to provide the URL, which is API and then login, and then we need to provide the options object. Now we need to fetch the response JSON, and that can be done by calling the response.json function. So JSON obj equals to await response.json. This will return the JSON object. Now we need to check if the token is there. If it is there, then we will save the token. Otherwise we are always going to set the message which is returned into this span message. So let's just do that. If JSON obj dot JWT token, if it exists, then we are going to save it somewhere. So for that, let's create a variable in the beginning. So let token equals to empty, right? So token equals to JSON obj dot JWT token, and let's also create another span to print the token, and for that I'm just going to paste it over here. So this span is going to show the token which has been returned from the server. So let's just set the text content of this span with the value of the token, and that's all we need to do for the token. And the last thing that we will do is to print the message which is being returned into the span message, so that we will see if the authentication is successful or if it failed. Now let's run this code once to see if it is working or not. So I ran the code and there is an error message. There is an unexpected token which we need to remove. So the problem over here is that I used a colon over here. Now let's save it. Alright, so now when I'm clicking on the login button, then the message is authentication successful. Of course there is no token right now because we need to write the code to generate the token. To create the token, the first thing that we will do is to create a dedicated class to generate the token, and for that I'm going to add a new folder, and let's just call this folder as JWT. Inside this JWT folder I'm going to add a new class, and let's just call this class as, you know what, let's just call it token manager. So inside this token manager we need to have a couple of methods, and we will also need to create a couple more classes for the tokens header and payload. So first let's just create the methods which we will need. The first one is going to be the create method, and this is going to, you know what, let's just name it create token. This is going to accept the argument for the user object, and we need to get the namespace for the models. So JWT dot models, right? And this is going to return a string, and you know what, right now just return an empty string until we implement it. The second method which we are going to use is to get the user information from a token, and for that what we can do is public user, and then let's just call it get user string token. Let's just for now return a new user. We will also need to create the classes for the token header and the token payload. So public class token header, this is going to have the property public string algorithm get set, and then okay, public string, and then this is going to be the type, Now let's have another class for the token payload. So token payload, this is going to have the property for the username and for also the privilege of the user. Like for example, if the user is a normal user or if he is an admin. Now for the rest of this stuff, we need to include some more namespaces. The first one is going to be the newtonsouth.json to convert the header and payload objects into JSON string. The second one that we are going to use is the microsoft.asp.netcore.webutilities. We will need this namespace to convert the class into base 64 URL encoding. The third one that we will need is system.text to get the byte array from any string. The last one is the system.security.cryptography to compute the hash to get the signature value. So cryptography, and that's pretty much it. Now let's write the implementation for create token method, and this is important, so pay attention over here. The first thing that we need to do is to create the objects for the token header and the token payload. So token header, let's just call it header equals to new token header, and we can provide the value for ALG as the HMAC SHA 256, and it is going to be HS 256, and we need to provide the value for type. This is going to be JWT. Now the second object that we need to create is for the token payload. Let's just call it payload and new token payload. We need to provide the value for the user. This is going to be the user dot name, and we need to provide the value for the privilege. This is going to be user dot privilege. Okay, now we need to convert this header and payload objects into JSON strings. So string header JSON equals to JSON convert dot serialize object, and then we can provide the header object as an argument over here. And similarly we can compute the payload JSON by providing the payload as an argument. And now we will need the byte array for the header JSON string and the payload JSON string. So byte, let's just call it header JSON bytes, and we can compute the bytes, or we can get the bytes by calling encoding dot let's use UTF-8 encoding dot get bytes, and we need to provide the header JSON string over here. Similarly we can get the byte array for the payload. So payload JSON bytes equals to encoding dot UTF-8 dot get bytes, and then payload JSON. The next step is to compute the header JSON bytes and payload JSON bytes into the base 64 URL encoding. So let's just create a string field, and let's just call it header base 64 encoded equals to, and we can do that by calling web encoders dot base 64 URL encode, and we need to provide the argument for the header JSON bytes. Similarly we can compute the payload base 64 encoded. So payload base 64 encoded, and we need to provide the argument of payload JSON bytes over here. Now we have the encodings for the header and payload, and now we need to compute the signature. For that, first let's have an empty signature field. We are going to use the SHA 256 algorithm to compute the signature. So using HMAC SHA 256 and then HMAC equals to new HMAC 256, and we need to provide a secret key over here, and I'm just going to add a very long secret which we will use, and I'm just going to place the secret into the class itself as a constant, so that the get user method will also be able to use the same secret. So we need to provide this secret as an argument over here. Also, this secret right now is in the form of a string, so we need to convert it into a bytes array, so we can use the same method which we used above, the encoding.utf8.getBytes. And then what we can do is we can compute the signature bytes. So byte array, let's just call it signature bytes equals to hmac dot compute hash. Now we need to compute the hash. For that we need to get the bytes of these base 64 encoded header and payload. For that, first we need to concatenate the header and payload, and then we need to convert them into a byte array. So encoding.utf8.getBytes. Now to concatenate them, I'm going to use string.format. So string.format, and then we are going to use the tokens for the header and payload. So let's just provide their string values. So first one is the header base 64 encoded, and the second one is the payload base 64 encoded. Let's just close everything, and now we will get the signature bytes over here. And now we will convert this signature bytes array into a base 64 URL encoding. So signature equals to, let's copy this one from over here, webencoders.base64 URL encode, and then provide the signature bytes as the argument. Now to return the signature, first we should check if its length is bigger than 0. So if the signature's length is more than 0, then we will return the concatenated header, payload, and signature. So string.format, and actually this needs to be capital, and okay, so string.format, and then the header, and then actually single dot, and then the payload, and then it's the signature. Now let's provide their values, the header, the payload, and then finally the signature. All right, otherwise we will simply return an empty string. Okay, so the method to compute and create the token has been created, and now it's time to return the token when the user is being authenticated into the login controller. For that, first we need to include the namespace for the token manager. So JWT basics.jwt, and now we need to create an object of the token manager. So token manager equals to new token manager. Now we need to create a new token. So string token equals to token manager dot create token, and we need to provide the user object. So new user, and the what was the property name? I guess it was name. Okay, it should be over here, right? So name equals to the login obj dot name, because we can use this name because the user has been authenticated. And we can provide a privilege. Let's just set the privilege value as admin right now, and that should be it to get the token. And we can return this token into the JWT token property. Now let's run the code and see if we are getting the token or not. Let's click on login. So we are getting the token. This is the header, and this is the payload. I guess you can see the dot, like there's the first dot, so it is between the header and the payload. There is a second dot which is between the payload and this signature. Now it's time to call the employee controller from the index.cshtml file to get the list of employees. For that purpose, first I will add a button btn employee list to get the list of employees. Let's also add the reference for the btn employee list, and that can be done by simply using document.querySelector and using the id. Now I'm going to copy this same add event listener code from over here, and I will use it for BTN employee list. When it will be clicked, then we will call a function which will be called as get employee list. And now it's time to create this new function, and this is going to be an async function with the name get employee list. Let's take a look at the employee controller. This is a controller with a single get method, and this is right now returning only the list of employees. What we have to do is we need to fetch the token from the authorization header, and then we will send the token to the token manager. The token manager will then return the user object. We need to check the name of the user. If it is the correct user, then we will next check if the user has the admin privilege. If it is, then we will return the list of employees. Otherwise, we will simply return a message that the authorization has failed. So let's write the code for the get employee list function. The first thing that we need to do is to create the options object. So options is an object with the method value as get, and then we need to provide the headers object. So headers is going to be an object, and we need to provide the authorization key value pair. So the authorization is going to have the value of the token, but the token needs to be provided by following a specific schema which is called as bearer schema. So we need to first write bearer following with a white space, and then we can provide the tokens value, and that's pretty much it for the options object. Now let's call the fetch API to call the employee controller. So let me just scroll it so that you guys can see it. Let response equals to await fetch, and then we need to provide the API and then the employee controllers name. So it is employee, and then we need to provide the options object. Now let's fetch the JSON object. So JSON obj equals to await response.json. Now we will simply log to the console the list of the employees, but for that we need to return the employee list along with a message property, and that can be done by first fetching the list of employees in a different field. So I'm going to convert this code over here, and let's convert it into a field. And now let's just return a new object, and this is going to have the properties of first the message. If we are returning the employee list, then the authorization is successful. So let's just return a single message called as successful, and next let's just return the list of employees. So we can log this employees list into the console to see the list, and that can be done by simply calling console.log and then JSON obj.employees. If the employees are not returned, then an undefined will be printed, otherwise the list of employees will be printed. And lastly, let's just set the message in the span message. And now it's time to write the code for the token manager to get the user object from a token string. For that, first we will split the token in three parts. So a string array, and then let's call it parts equals to token.split, and this will be split by the dot character. Now let's check if the parts length is 3. So if parts.length is 3, then we can proceed. Now we need to compute and check the signature if the integrity of the token is maintained or not. So let's just do that. String signature equals to an empty string, and using I'm just going to copy this statement from over here, because we are again going to create the same object using hmac sha256. Using the secret key, we can compute the signature bytes. So what we can do is we can create the byte array. Let's just call it signature bytes, and I'm sorry for all of these honkings from outside, it's kind of a loud neighborhood. So hmac dot compute hash, and then you know what, let's just first get the bytes, so we can do that by calling encoding dot UTF-8 dot get bytes, because we have used UTF-8 encoding in the create token method too, so that we are using the same encoding over here. So UTF-8 dot get bytes, and now we need to get the bytes for the concatenated header and payload. So let's just do that. So string dot format, and then first one is the header and the second one is the payload, and we are going to use the first part for the headers value, and we are going to use the second part for the payload value, and that should be it to compute the signature bytes. And now we can get the base 64 encoded signature by simply calling signature equals to web encoders dot base 64 URL encode, and then we can provide the signature bytes over here as an argument. Now we have the signature, and now we need to check if this computed signature is equal to the signature which is incoming in the token. So for that we can use a simple if condition. If signature is equals to the third part, which is the signature in the token, actually it will be 2 over here, it means that the integrity of the token is maintained and we can create the new user. So first let's just create the header JSON. So string header JSON equals to encoding dot UTF-8. okay, it's a typo, encoding. I am not really sure why I'm making so much typos. I guess I should just copy the method names, it's kind of fast. So get string, and then we can decode the first part using the base 64 URL encoding. So web encoders dot base 64 URL decode, and then we need to provide the first part which has the header, so parts 0. Alright, so I'm just going to copy this line and I will use it for the payload too. So payload JSON equals to base 64 URL decode the second part. Now to create token header and token payload objects out of the header JSON and payload JSON, we can use JSON convert dot deserialize object. So token header, let's just call it header, equals to JSON convert dot deserialize object. We need to provide the type, which is token header, and then we can provide the JSON string, which is this one. And I'm just going to copy and paste for token payload, let's just call it payload, and then use the correct type over here and use the correct JSON string over here. Now we have the objects, and all we need to do now is to return the user object. So return new user. So name is going to be the payload dot user, and let's also get the privilege. So privilege equals to payload dot privilege. Alright, so if none of these things are true, then we can simply return a new user. Otherwise, a user with the required information will be returned. Now it's time to go to the employee controller and fetch the user object from the token string which we are getting into the header. So let's just do that. First we need to create the token manager, but before that we need to include the JWT namespace. So token manager equals to new token manager. It's just same code, all that repetitive stuff, but we have to do it. Let's just fetch the authorization header key value pair from the request. So let's just call it authorization header equals to request dot headers dot, we need to find it by the key value. So first or default, so actually h dot key equals to, this is going to be the authorization header, so we need to find it by using that. And now to get the user, we will simply send the value of this authorization header key value pair into the token manager's get user function as an argument. So user equals to token manager dot get user, and what we need to do is first we need to fetch the value, but we need to remove the bearer schema or the bearer part. So toString dot replace, and let's just replace the bearer and white space with an empty string. Now we have the user. Now it's time to first authenticate the user, and we will again use the hard coding for that. If user dot name equals to John, then we need to check if the user is authorized to get the list of employees, and that can be done by checking the privilege value. If user dot privilege equals to admin, then we are going to return the list of employees with the successful message. If the privilege is not admin, then we can simply return another object with a message saying that authorization failed. If the authentication failed, then we can return another message simply saying that the authentication failed. All right, so our employee controllers get method has been finished too. And do we need to do anything else? I don't think so. Now let's just run the code to see if everything is going to run as we expect it to. So this is the web page, and I'm going to open up the console. Let's first log in. We have the token. Now let's click on get employees. So we have the employee list. Wow, we managed to run the code in the first try. All right, now let's use a different authorization for the user and see if we are getting the list of employees or not. For that, I'm just going to change the privilege from admin to, let's say, a normal user. So now the code in the employee controller should not allow us to get the list of employees. First login, we have the token, click on get employees. Now it is undefined and the message is authorization failed because the privilege is not sufficient to fetch the list of employees. This is how the JWT tokens are constructed at the core level, and this is how the tokens are deconstructed to fetch the information which is contained inside the header and payload. Now again, I am advising you not to write your own code for transmitting tokens between parties. If you are an individual developer, then please don't do that, because there is so much involved in creating this architecture. There needs to be different kinds of validations and different kinds of testing. So it is always a better idea to rely on an already existing library or framework to deal with the JSON Web Tokens to authenticate and authorize our users. And I guess with that, I will take my leave. So thank you so much for watching this long video, I guess. And if you think that you like this video, then please place a like on it. And also you can subscribe if you want to, because then you will be able to get the news about the latest video updates. So that would be a good thing to do. And I will see you in the next video. Till then, have a great time.